The Murder of Lloyd Avery II by Cellmate Kevin Roby. From Hollywood Spotlight to Pelican Bay Shadows. Like, comment, and subscribe if you think Hollywood's darkest secrets aren't found on red carpets, but in prison cells where nobody is watching. Because in this story the spotlight didn't fade, it was extinguished. The rise before the fall. In 1991, the world first saw Lloyd Avery II on the big screen. He wasn't the star of Boyz and the Hood, that belonged to Cuba Gooding Jr. and Ice Cube, but his role was unforgettable. As the trigger-happy gang member who fired the fatal shots at Ricky, his image was forever seared into pop culture's memory. Tall, sharp-featured, with eyes that burned intensity, Avery carried an aura that directors loved. He could embody menace without saying much. Hollywood began to notice. But off-screen, Avery's life was unraveling in ways few could imagine. Behind the roles and the parties, Avery was a young man struggling with identity, direction, and the magnetic pull of the streets. The same violence he portrayed on screen seeped into his real life. Arrests followed. Fights. A reputation for erratic behavior. By the late 1990s, the industry's doors quietly closed on him. Then came the case that sealed his fate. In 1999, Avery was arrested for a double homicide in Los Angeles. Prosecutors alleged he shot two people in what police described as a gang-related killing. The trial dragged, the evidence was murky, but the damage was done. By 2001 he was convicted and sentenced to life. Hollywood was gone. Pelican Bay awaited. Pelican Bay, the end of the road. Built in the fog-choked forests of Northern California, Pelican Bay State Prison was never meant for redemption. It was designed to contain California's most violent, unmanageable men, the predators of predators. Its Security Housing Unit, or SHU, was notorious for long-term solitary confinement, where men spent 23 hours a day locked in windowless cells. Avery was transferred here in the early 2000s. To many it felt like the final irony. The actor who once pretended to be a ruthless killer on screen now lived among the real ones, locked in a fortress of steel and silence. Inside, Avery was different. Accounts from fellow inmates and even some guards described him as spiritual, calm, even gentle. He rejected gang affiliations. He studied religion. Some said he turned toward Christianity, carrying a Bible with him, quoting scripture in the yard. But prison is no sanctuary. Faith and peace do not shield you from the chaos of the tier. And in 2005, fate paired him with a man whose darkness was bottomless. Kevin Roby. Kevin Roby, the self-proclaimed Satanist. Roby was a predator long before Pelican Bay. His rap sheet stretched back decades: violence, sexual assault, and disturbing episodes that hinted at a fractured mind consumed by obsession. But what truly defined him inside the prison walls was his claim. He was a practicing Satanist. Roby didn't just read books or wear inverted crosses. He lived it. Other inmates feared him not because of physical size but because of his manic devotion to rituals. He talked of demons, of blood sacrifice, of ancient forces guiding his hand. Guards wrote him off as insane, a man too far gone for reason. Pairing him with Avery was, in hindsight, a catastrophic mistake. Cellmates. Prisons often shuffle inmates, pairing men together in cells where tension simmers just below the surface. In Pelican Bay, a bad match could mean days of screaming arguments, weeks of manipulation, or sudden violence. When Avery was assigned to share a cell with Roby, the contrast was stark. One man searching for light, the other steeped in darkness. They clashed almost immediately. Arguments over faith, over beliefs, over space. But Avery held firm. He quoted scripture. He prayed aloud. He told Roby that evil had no hold over him. For Roby, this wasn't just annoying, it was blasphemy. In his twisted worldview, Avery became a target. A challenge to his faith. The day of the murder. September 4, 2005. A Sunday. The prison routine was predictable. Counts, meals, the monotonous rhythm of confinement. Guards performed their rounds, peering into cells, ticking boxes, logging head counts. But something was terribly wrong inside Cell 8 of Pelican Bay's maximum security wing. By later accounts, the altercation began with words. Roby accused Avery of mocking his rituals. Avery, steadfast, refused to yield. Shouting escalated into blows. Roby, stronger and more unhinged, overpowered the actor. The details that followed remain chilling. Roby beat Avery mercilessly, then strangled him with improvised bindings. When Avery's body fell limp, Roby didn't stop. He smeared his blood on the walls and satanic symbols, a ritualistic display of dominance. To Roby, this was not murder. It was sacrifice. The disturbing aftermath. What shocked observers most wasn't only the brutality of the crime, but how long it went unnoticed. Prison officers conducted multiple inmate counts after Avery's death. They looked into the cell, marked both men as present, and moved on. Avery's lifeless body lay just out of view, concealed by Roby's manipulation. For more than a day, Avery remained undiscovered. It was only when the smell of blood and the silence inside the cell drew suspicion that guards finally intervened. By then, the damage was irreversible. The news breaks. When the story hit the press, it was met with disbelief. Hollywood tabloids framed it as Boyz and the Hood star murdered in prison. But the deeper true crime world saw it differently, as a glaring example of system failure. How could a man be murdered in a maximum security cell and left unnoticed for so long? How could a known Satanist, a man with violent delusions, be paired with someone like Avery? And why did the system seem indifferent to the warning signs? The prison issued a bland statement, "Inmate altercation under investigation." But the truth was uglier. It was negligence, bureaucracy, and a lack of humanity that allowed the killing to happen and remain hidden. Legacy of fear. 4 inmates inside Pelican Bay, the murder was another reminder that no one was safe. If Hollywood actors could die in forgotten corners, what chance did the nameless men have? 4 families on the outside, it was a nightmare, proof that their loved ones were pawns in a system that often failed to protect even the most basic human dignity. And for those who knew Avery, it was a tragedy of wasted potential. A man who once stood in front of cameras, immortalized in one of cinema's most famous scenes, reduced to a headline about blood on cell walls. But here's where the story twists. Investigators soon uncovered details about Roby's writings, journals filled with plans for sacrifices, lists of targets, and ramblings about prophets and non-believers. Avery wasn't chosen at random. He was, in Roby's mind, an appointed victim. And yet, buried in those same pages was a claim even more chilling. "They let me do it. They wanted me to finish the work." Who was they? Guards who looked the other way? Other inmates who fed his madness? Or just the fragmented delusions of a killer? What's certain is this: the unanswered questions didn't die in that cell. They grew. The devil in the cell. You think prison is about punishment? You think it's about justice? Then explain to me how a man like Kevin Roby was handed the keys to a human soul. Subscribe if you dare, because what's about to unfold will make you question whether the system ever cared about life at all. The shadow before Pelican Bay. Kevin Roby didn't become a monster inside Pelican Bay. He carried the darkness with him long before the prison walls closed in. Born into a fractured home in Los Angeles in the late 1950s, Roby's early life was marked by violence, instability, and abuse. By his teenage years he was already dabbling in crime, petty theft, burglary, assault. But what unsettled neighbors and authorities wasn't just his criminal behavior, it was his fixation on the occult. Long before Satanism was a word whispered in pop culture circles, Roby was already studying ritualistic texts, carving symbols into his skin, and talking openly about blood offerings. Teachers described him as detached from reality. Police reports from the 1970s documented bizarre behavior, breaking into abandoned houses and covering the walls in cryptic graffiti, or standing in the middle of the street at night, chanting phrases no one understood. By the 1980s, Roby's crimes escalated. He was linked to violent assaults and a rape case that carried disturbing ritualistic overtones. Victims described him as both methodical and manic, a man who blended physical brutality with religious delusion. His sentencing eventually led him to California's prison system. And in 1994, after multiple violent outbursts in other facilities, he was transferred to the most secure institution the state had, Pelican Bay. Satanism in a concrete box. In prison, identities become armor. Some men wear gang tattoos. Others wrap themselves in religion. Kevin Roby wrapped himself in Satan. He declared himself a high priest of the Satanic Temple of Antichrist, a title no recognized church had ever heard of but one that Roby wore like a crown. His cell was cluttered with occult writings, hand-drawn pentagrams, and journals filled with proclamations of his mission. Prison officials logged his behavior as disturbed but manageable. They noted his constant rants about demons and gods, but as long as he didn't attack staff, he was left alone. After all, Pelican Bay was built for killers, and compared to others, Roby's antics were treated like background noise. But inmates weren't fooled. They whispered about him on the yard. They saw his eyes, wild, unblinking, filled with something not of this world. Many refused to be housed near him. To share a cell with Roby was seen as a death sentence. And yet, in 2005, the system made the pairing. The fatal match. The decision to place Lloyd Avery II in the same cell as Kevin Roby remains one of the most baffling and damning administrative choices in Pelican Bay's history. Avery by then was known as a quiet inmate, a man who prayed openly, who quoted the Bible, who told others he was seeking redemption. His faith wasn't performative, it was his survival mechanism. He believed that light could endure even in the darkest corners. Roby was the opposite, a self-styled prophet of evil, a man who claimed to thrive on darkness. Two ideologies locked in an 8 by 10-foot box. No buffer. No oversight. No separation. Some guards later admitted they raised concerns. Others claimed the computer system made the assignment automatically. Whatever the truth, it was negligence at its most catastrophic. A clash of beliefs. From the start, their cell was a battleground of words. Avery would pray loudly at night. Roby would chant incantations in response. Avery quoted scripture about salvation. Roby mocked him, saying Satan had already claimed his soul. Inmates in nearby cells recalled hearing arguments that lasted for hours. Some claimed Avery tried to save Roby, to bring him toward faith. Others said Roby laughed and told him, "God isn't here. Only I am." Tension was inevitable. Violence was guaranteed. The killing in detail. The night of September 4, 2005, the argument turned deadly. According to the investigative report, Roby later described the event as an act of purification. He claimed Avery had mocked his rituals one time too many. Fueled by rage and delusion, Roby launched his attack. He beat Avery relentlessly, using his fists and whatever objects he could grab in the cell. Then, in what he described as a binding, he strangled Avery, cutting off his last breath. But what came after was even more disturbing. Roby smeared Avery's blood on the walls, forming inverted crosses and cryptic phrases. He positioned the body in a grotesque posture, as if offering him as a sacrifice. Guards who later entered the cell described the scene as ritualistic and nightmarish, a tableau of insanity that looked more like a horror movie than a prison crime. The failure of the system. The most damning part of the case wasn't just the murder, it was what happened afterward. Prison guards conducted multiple head counts in the hours following Avery's death. Each time they looked into the cell and marked both inmates as present. Because Roby manipulated the scene. He propped Avery's body in a way that made it appear he was sleeping or lying still. It wasn't until more than 36 hours later that officers realized something was wrong. The smell. The silence. The grotesque symbols on the wall. By then, Avery's body was decomposing. The delay raised explosive questions. How could one of California's most secure prisons fail to detect a murder for over a day? Why was Roby not housed alone, given his documented instability? And most chilling, were staff simply negligent, or did some turn a blind eye? The journals of Kevin Roby. After the killing, investigators searched Roby's cell thoroughly. What they found was a window into his diseased mind. Stacks of journals, filled with scrawled handwriting, detailed his religion. Pages upon pages of ramblings described a war between light and darkness. Avery's name appeared repeatedly in the weeks before the murder. Roby referred to him as the chosen lamb and the mocker of faith. One passage, written just days before the murder, read, "The sacrifice approaches. He carries the false word of God and it must be silenced. Through his blood, the ritual will be sealed." But even more alarming were the claims that followed. Roby wrote that he had been allowed to act, that others opened the way for him. He referenced guards by cryptic nicknames, suggesting he believed, or wanted others to believe, that staff were complicit in his actions. Whether this was delusion or a reflection of some truth remains unresolved. The public shock. When the news finally broke, the reaction was electric. The Hollywood press latched onto Avery's name, Boyz and the Hood star murdered in prison. The true crime community dug into the bizarre ritualistic nature of the killing. Civil rights groups condemned Pelican Bay for negligence, demanding accountability. Avery's family, devastated, asked the hardest questions of all. How could a man who once stood under movie lights end up butchered in the dark, his death unnoticed for so long? The prison offered no satisfying answers. Just a sterile press release, citing inmate-on-inmate violence, as though it were another routine fight. But those who knew the truth understood it was far more sinister. The ghosts of Pelican Bay. Even after the murder, Roby remained in Pelican Bay, housed in deeper isolation. But the fear he created lingered. Inmates whispered about the cell where Avery died. Guards avoided discussing the incident. Some believed Roby's journals were nothing but madness. Others believed they hinted at something darker, Systemic corruption, deliberate negligence, a willingness to let violence happen as long as it kept the population under control. And for Detective Laura Stein, who years later would investigate another Pelican Bay death, the murder of Lloyd Avery became a case study in how the prison's walls didn't just contain violence. They sometimes enabled it. But here's where Chapter 2 ends, with one detail most people never knew. Among Roby's journals was a final page written the day after Avery's death. The sacrifice is complete. But the blood will not stop here. Others will come. They already know. The handwriting was shaky, frantic, but deliberate. And in the margins, barely visible, was a symbol that prison officials swore they had seen before. Not in Roby's cell, but in graffiti scrawled across the tunnels beneath Pelican Bay. Was it coincidence? Was it delusion? Or was Roby tapping into a network of violence that ran deeper than anyone dared admit? Whatever the truth, Lloyd Avery was gone. But his murder had opened a wound in Pelican Bay that would bleed for years. The forgotten Hollywood star. They say justice is blind. But if you believe that, explain Pelican Bay. Explain how a man could die in plain sight, and the system still claimed it didn't see a thing. Subscribe now, because the shadows of this case don't end in 2005. They stretch forward right to this very moment. The morning after. The morning after guards finally discovered Lloyd Avery II's lifeless body, Pelican Bay locked down. Sirens wailed through the compound. Inmates were ordered face down on the cold concrete floors, shackled one by one, marched back to their cells. The scene in Avery's cell was grisly. Crime scene photos later revealed blood smeared across the walls in jagged patterns, symbols scrawled in red, the twisted body of the former actor lying stiff. For the correctional officers it was shocking, yes, but it wasn't new. Pelican Bay had seen violence before. Men stabbed with shanks in the yard. Men strangled with torn bedsheets. But this was different. The ritualistic display. The sheer delay in detection. And the fact that this wasn't just any inmate. This was a man who had once stood beneath Hollywood lights. The investigation. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, announced an immediate inquiry. But from the start, Avery's family and the public sensed stonewalling. Reports were vague, language sterile, inmate altercation, security protocols under review, investigation pending. Privately, investigators wrestled with the evidence. Kevin Roby confessed almost immediately. To him it wasn't a crime. It was prophecy. I had to cleanse him, he said in interviews. He mocked the faith. He denied the truth. His death was necessary. Roby showed no remorse. He described the murder as a ritual sacrifice, a final step in a dark journey he had been writing about in his journals for decades. Roby's writings. The journals became central to understanding the crime. Dozens of spiral notebooks, filled cover to cover with dense handwriting, illustrated Roby's descent into madness. He called himself the Christ of Satan, the chosen vessel to bring balance to a world drowned in false light. He described Pelican Bay as his temple. Guards were demons in uniforms, inmates souls to be harvested. In passages written weeks before the murder, he fixated on Avery. He reads the false book. He speaks false words. His blood is the seal. The sacrifice comes. His fame means nothing here. His face will fall into shadow. To prosecutors, these writings painted a picture of premeditation. Roby had planned Avery's murder, not in sudden rage but as part of a long-imagined ritual. The trial that wasn't. Ordinarily, a prison murder would lead to a public trial, more years tacked onto a sentence, another headline verdict. But in Roby's case, the system quietly closed ranks. He was already serving life for previous violent crimes. Adding another conviction would change nothing. Instead, Roby was placed in permanent solitary confinement, stripped of privileges, locked away in a cell where even other inmates couldn't see him. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. No chance for Avery's family to confront him before a jury. Just paperwork, stamped and filed, sealing away one of the most disturbing prison murders in California history. To the family it felt like another betrayal. The family's grief. For Avery's loved ones, the news shattered them. His mother, Linda, wept publicly, telling reporters, "He wasn't perfect, but he was my son. He had dreams. He had talent. He wasn't just a number in a prison log. He didn't deserve to die like that." Friends from Hollywood expressed shock. Actor Wood Harris, who had worked with Avery, said, "Lloyd had a light in him. Yeah, he lost his way. But no one should go out like that. It's like Hollywood forgot him and then the system erased him." The family tried to sue the state for negligence, arguing that Pelican Bay had failed to protect him. But legal barriers, bureaucracy, and immunity laws shielded the prison. Their case never made it past early hearings. Media frenzy. For tabloids, the case was irresistible. Headlines screamed, "Boyz and the Hood star killed in prison ritual." Hollywood actor murdered by Satanist cellmate. Blood sacrifice inside America's most secure prison. But as fast as the story rose, it faded. By 2006, Avery's name was forgotten by most. He was another statistic. Another inmate gone. The spectacle replaced by the next crime story. Yet for true crime followers, the details lingered. The bizarre pairing, the ritualistic display, the failure of guards to detect the murder for over a day. Pelican Bay's silence. Inside the prison, the administration worked hard to erase the scandal. Guards were retrained. Cellmate pairing protocols were reviewed. But no one was fired. No one was held personally accountable. Pelican Bay moved on. Another body. Another headline. But inmates didn't forget. They whispered about Roby's cell, about the screams that night, about the smell that clung to the tier long after Avery's body was removed. Some said the cell was cursed. Others claimed Roby laughed when guards finally pulled him out, shouting, "The sacrifice is complete." The legacy of Kevin Roby. Roby remained in isolation for the rest of his life. Even there he continued writing. Guards who handled his mail reported bizarre ramblings still flowing from his pen. Letters filled with threats, symbols, and proclamations of coming blood. In one chilling note, confiscated years later, he wrote, "Avery was the first but not the last. The temple is not closed. The work continues." Whether these were the delusions of a madman or a coded message to someone outside has never been determined. Lloyd Avery's legacy. For Hollywood, Avery became a footnote. The man who once played a ruthless killer on screen, only to become a victim of one in real life. But for those who knew him, his story was more complicated. He was a young man with talent, swallowed by the same violence he once portrayed. He struggled with choices, with faith, with demons, both inside and outside himself. And in the end, his life was stolen by a man who saw him not as a person, but as a symbol in a twisted religion. Why it matters. The murder of Lloyd Avery II isn't just a story about one actor or one prison. It's a story about neglect. About how systems fail when people inside them are treated as disposable. About how prisons, built to contain violence, sometimes incubate it instead. It's about the blind spots, literal and metaphorical, that allow evil to fester until it explodes in blood. And it's about how society looks away, forgetting the victims once the headlines fade. The haunting ending. Years later, a journalist obtained copies of Roby's journals through a Freedom of Information request. Most were incoherent. But one entry, dated the week after Avery's murder, stood out. The blood spoke. It told me he was not the last. Others will come. The walls are hungry. And they will eat again. To this day, Pelican Bay refuses to release the full contents of those writings. And to this day, Avery's family lives with the memory of a son who once stood in Hollywood lights, only to die, forgotten, in a cage smeared with his own blood. They thought Lloyd Avery's murder was the end of the story. But in Pelican Bay, stories never end. They rot in silence until another body falls. And the question remains, was Kevin Roby just one madman, or was he proof that the prison itself has a hunger no one can satisfy? If you think this story was haunting, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, because some shadows can't be ignored and the darkest ones are still waiting.